Hey, Brandon with Bound and Lies back again for part 2 of our video response to some of the claims that were made by Dan McClellan in one of his videos. Now, before we get started and start getting into the additional claims that Dan had in his video, if you've watched this channel for any period of time, hopefully you have come to understand that one thing that I value is truth, honesty, and integrity. And so there's something that has quite honestly been weighing on my heart that I felt obligated or convicted to kind of share with you. Something I struggle with. I have a lot of good days, but quite frankly, I have a lot of bad days, especially in the last 3 to 4 years. I've really struggled with the bad days outweighing the good days. So I just wanted to take a minute and kind of open up and kind of share one of my struggles with you. I am a New York Giants fan. Now, I'm fully aware that this confession may cause some of my audience to leave. I may lose subscribers. But my hope is that through this, it does show a level of commitment, level of courage, and helps you know that no matter how difficult the truth is to discuss and to talk about, that's what we're here to do. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's move on to tackling some of the additional claims that Dan McClellan made in his video that we covered part 1 of last week, and seeing if any of these additional claims can hold up when we start presenting evidence and facts, or if the foundations of his claim begin to erode once we start investigating it. Here we go.
We got just everything you need. We're here to take the lead. It's not like anything you've seen.
All right, so if you were with us last week, you know that we went through 6 of Dan's claims that he made in his video, and we kind of held them up to some evidence and some facts to see if they could stand on their own merit. And unfortunately, they didn't just fail, they completely crumbled. So I'm not going to lie, I was hoping for a little bit more of a challenge, but the final score that we're going to have tonight is Data 6, Dogma 0. Now this week, we're going to be looking at some additional claims that he made in the video that we didn't have time to tackle last week. And this first claim is going to be a long one. I'm just going to let you know right up front that it is not an easy claim to deal with or to tackle. However, it is one that is becoming increasingly more common. And so it is very important that we deal with it, that we talk about it, and that we actually evaluate it to see if it's true. Now, on this particular claim, I'm going to let Dan kind of do his thing. We're going to play the clip of him speaking and going through and explaining his side of things. And then we're going to go back and we're going to look at the things that he said and see if it actually holds up to the evidence that we have. Now, I am going to interject once in a while throughout it just to kind of set the tone, but I do want to tackle the majority of this conversation once he's done. And so I do want to let him get his complete claim out before we start evaluating any kind of truth or non-truth regarding his particular claim.
But let's move on. 2 Kings 3:27, this is a really cool story about an Israelite, Judahite, Edomite coalition that tries to invade Moab in order to return Moab to vassalage after the king has tried to throw off that vassalage to Israel. They're about to fulfill a prophecy given to the prophet by Adonai when this happens. Then he, and this is likely Mesha, the king of Moab.
So maybe a small detail, but it is not likely the king of Moab. It is definitively the king of Moab. And we'll look at that when we read the entire text once we let Dan finish his claim.
Took his firstborn son who was to succeed him and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. And great wrath came upon Israel, so they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. So in the story, the coalition fails in their goal to return Moab to vassalage. They retreat without having fulfilled the prophecy. Why? Because the king sacrificed his son and heir on the city wall. And then it says, great wrath came upon Israel. The word here for wrath, ketsef, the noun, only ever occurs in narrative in reference to the wrath of God.
So just like last week, put a pin in that because we're going to come back to it later. But just remember that Dan specifically said himself, it only ever occurs in narrative when talking about the wrath of God.
Now, this is one instance where it can't be Adonai, the God of Israel, that is responsible for this wrath. That doesn't make any sense.
So again, just keep in mind that this entire video, if you watched part 1, Dan has been cautioning us about something very specific, and that is taking our own beliefs, our own pre-held assumptions, and injecting them into the text, and saying that when certain people find two portions of scripture that don't seem to align with each other, rather than letting the text speak for itself, we take our own pre-held biases and our own pre-held opinions and beliefs and inject them into the text to get the meaning that we want. And get ready, buckle up, because Dan's going to do just exactly that in a minute. He doesn't like the way the text speaks, so he's going to invent and inject his own opinion, his own pre-held biases into the text to form an interpretation that he offers literally no evidence for other than his interpretation and telling you, if you don't believe what I tell you it means, then you are wrong, which again would make Dan guilty of ignoring the facts, ignoring the evidence, and just asking you as the viewer to swallow his dogma. No questions allowed.
Which is why scholars acknowledge, and I have a survey I'm working on that will allow me to be able to say whether or not it's a majority. I don't know at this point, but a lot of prominent scholars agree.
So I'm going to save you the trouble of holding your breath, waiting for Dan's survey to come out, because I searched for over 3 days trying to find just one well-respected biblical scholar who would interpret this passage the way that Dan chooses to, and I couldn't find even one. So while I'm not saying that there isn't anybody out there who holds the same opinion that Dan does, I am saying that it is unquestionably not consensus.
That this can only refer to the wrath of a deity, and in this case it must be the wrath of the patron deity of Moab, Chemosh, who must have driven out the invading force. Now, if you are thinking, oh, I can resolve this, I can harmonize these two things, that's you bringing those interpretive lenses, those priors to the text and telling the text what it is and is not allowed to say. In other words, Adonai was defeated by the God of another nation. That is the only way to interpret this text that does not require we just make up out of whole cloth scenarios that are not in evidence in order to skirt around the plain and most likely sense of the text to arrive at what we think the text is allowed to say.
I'm sorry, I am really trying to hold a straight face, but I'm sure that you just saw that Dan went from, we have to let the text speak for itself, we can never inject our own opinions and biases into the text, to, that doesn't seem to make any sense. Well, guess what? I have an idea what I think it means, and if you don't think it means the same thing, then you're wrong, because what I think it means is the only possible interpretation of the way that this text could be interpreted. There is no other option. Even though I'm not going to provide you any evidence to support my claim, and you're also going to have to intentionally ignore all the other pieces of evidence and coincidences that could make any other theory plausible. And you're also going to have to accept that it's the least plausible explanation for what the text is actually trying to say. Now, my question to you would be, does that sound like data or dogma?
So I think that's a fascinating story. And obviously, the creator of that video is not going to agree regarding what the Bible says, because that's not what they think the Bible is allowed to say.
Well, there I think we can agree in that the content creator that Dan is referencing probably does not believe that. And that is because it is quite literally not what the Bible says. We just listened to Dan tell us, I don't like what the text has to say or how the text reads, so I'm going to tell you what it should say. And what I think it should say is the only way that it can possibly be interpreted, so you better believe me. And he quite literally tells us in the prior clip that this text doesn't seem to make any sense on the surface. So it must mean this, and it must be referencing that. All the while, he provides no evidence for his claim other than, this is what I want the text to say. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to read the story that Dan is taking this text from. Now, the chapter does end very abruptly. The story suddenly comes to a close, and we're not given a lot of details, which is why there is a few different theories in terms of what this text actually means. But what we want to do is look at it from a factual standpoint and an evidence-based standpoint, and see which of those theories make the most sense from a logical outcome, and which of those theories require us to make up whole scenarios, as Dan would say, in order to correlate the interpretation with the text. Now, to kind of expand on that idea, imagine I live in an apartment in the city directly above a train station. Every day, just like clockwork at 4 p.m., the train passes by. And when it does, the whole place shakes. My entire apartment shakes. The windows rattle, the cups on the counter vibrate, and you can feel a low rumble underneath your feet. It's not alarming because I've just come to expect it. Now, one afternoon, I have my friend over for coffee, and right at 4 p.m., the familiar rumble begins. The building shakes, the floor hums, and before I can even say anything, my friend jumps up and says, "What was that? Oh my gosh, it sounded like a herd of wild cattle stampeding through the streets." Technically, he's not wrong. It's possible that a herd of cattle could have broken loose and be running through downtown. But when we look at the situation logically, that situation or that theory would be incredibly unlikely. We're in a busy city. We're not on a ranch. There's no reason a herd of cattle would be in the streets, much less doing it at exactly the same time every single day. A simpler explanation that the train comes by every day at 4 o'clock and shakes the building not only fits the evidence, but it fits the pattern. It's consistent, it's predictable, and it's supported by past experiences. So while the stampede theory is technically possible, it stretches the bounds of probability and ignores clear evidence standing in front of us. And that's how truth works in life too. Sometimes people, like Dan, reach for dramatic, complicated explanations when the logical, consistent answer is sitting right in front of them. The goal shouldn't be to rule out every single wild possibility. It's easy to recognize that the most reasonable explanation, supported by evidence and pattern, is almost always going to be the right one. So when we read 2 Kings chapter 3, obviously we find one of the strangest and most debated war accounts in all of Scripture, as Dan pointed out. A coalition that was led by Jehoram of Israel and joined by King Jehoshaphat of Judah and the king of Edom marches against Moab after they rebel against Israel's control. But what starts out as a divinely sanctioned campaign soon spirals into total and utter confusion, ending with a human sacrifice and the Israelites withdrawing in defeat. So the three prevailing theories that we can look at is, did Yahweh's prophecy fail? And was Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, successful in defeating Yahweh? Was the prophecy fulfilled? And did the wrath come from the Moabite army who saw their king sacrifice his son and get stirred up in vengeance and anger and push Israel out of the land? Or did something much darker happen in Israel being guilty of human sacrifice and the wrath pouring forth from Yahweh and exiling them out of the land? So the chapter begins with the rebellion of Mesha. He was the king of Moab. Now, if we start at verse 1, we read, Joram, son of Ahab, became king of Israel in Samaria in the 18th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and he reigned for 12 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but not as his father and mother had done. He got rid of the sacred stone of Baal that his father had made. Nonetheless, he clung to the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit. He did not turn away from them. So here we have Joram becomes king of the northern tribes of Israel, and the text is explicit in pointing out that he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He wasn't as bad as his father Ahab and his mother Jezebel, but he led Israel into sin. Verse 4 reads, Now Mesha, king of Moab, raised sheep, and he had to pay the king of Israel a tribute of 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. But after Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. So at that time, King Joram set out from Samaria and mobilized all of Israel. So here we have the king of Moab, Mesha, who was under oath to Israel and under vassalage, meaning that they were just a territory that was subordinate to a more superior territory. In this case, Moab was seen as subordinate to Israel, and Israel ruled as the liege. And so Moab actually owed Israel a tribute or a tax, and they had to pay a tribute or a tax to the nation of Israel in order to keep peace. Now, after his father Ahab died, the text says that Mesha rebelled against Israel. He broke his oath, and he basically said, I'm not paying your tax anymore. If you want it, come and get it. And so King Joram decides to mobilize all of Israel to get together and go to war with Moab in order to bring them back under vassalage, or in simpler terms, to bring them back under control and squash the rebellion. So here's where we're going to get to the first of what I'm going to call our major coincidences that we're going to have to address at some point if we want to at least even entertain the idea that Dan's theory could be plausible. And we're going to have to address these at the end, so we're going to keep a list of the different coincidences that come up in the chapter so that when we're done, we can look at them and we can address them and we can see, based off of the different theories that we have and the evidence that we have, what makes the most logical conclusion. If we go to Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 9, we read, "The Lord warned us, do not bother the Moabites, the descendants of Lot, or start a war with them. For I have given them Ar as their property, and I will not give you any of their land." So here we find that all the way back in Deuteronomy, Israel was expressly commanded, do not bother the Moabites, and they were never supposed to make Moab a vassal nation to Israel. And this is a common theme that we're going to see throughout the chapter as we continue reading the story, that Israel is expressly and deliberately breaking commandments that were given to them by God as they go to war with Moab. Continuing on with our story, in 2 Kings 3, verse 7, we read, "He, Joram, also sent this message to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. The king of Moab has rebelled against me. Will you go with me to fight against Moab?" "I will go with you," he replied. "I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses." "By what route shall we attack?" he asked. "Through the desert of Edom," he answered. So the king of Israel set out with the king of Judah and the king of Edom, and after a roundabout march of 7 days, the army had no more water for themselves or for the animals that were with them. So here we have Joram, king of Israel, realizes that this war he's gonna need a little bit more of an army than what he has himself. So he goes to King Jehoshaphat of Judah and says, "Hey, I need to form an alliance. I need you to go to war with me. Will you go with me?" And Jehoshaphat says, "Sure. But what route are you going to take to get there?" And he says, "Oh, well, we're going to go through Edom." And so Joram contacts the king of Edom, and he also says, "Hey, do you want to form an alliance with me and Judah? We're going to go to war against Moab and bring them back under control to crush this rebellion." And the king of Edom agrees. And so Joram, Jehoshaphat, and the king of Edom all march in unison against the nation of Moab. Now, after they've been marching for 7 days, they start to realize we didn't really plan this out too well because our men and our animals are starting to run out of water. We pick up in verse 10. "What?" exclaimed the king of Israel. That's Joram. "Has the Lord called us 3 kings together only to deliver us into the hands of Moab?" But Jehoshaphat asked, "Is there no prophet of the Lord here through whom we may inquire of the Lord?" An officer of the king of Israel answered, "Elisha, son of Shaphat, is here. He used to pour water on the hands of Elijah." So Jehoshaphat said, "The word of the Lord is with him." So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom went down to him. So I think the first thing we need to point out is how Joram, king of Israel, is like, "What? Has God brought us 3 kings together just to deliver us into the hand of Moab?" When the text has made it extremely clear that he's been commanded by God not to mess with Moab. So for some reason, Joram is in self-denial and self-delusion, and he thinks that he's being divinely blessed by God, and this war is sanctioned by God for him to go and attack Moab, when in reality, he's been expressly commanded by God not to touch them. Then we have King Jehoshaphat, who's like, "Hey, is there a prophet around that we can inquire of God to kind of see what he thinks about this whole thing?" And then a dude from the army is like, "Hey, I know this guy. He's this prophet called Elisha. He used to serve the great prophet Elijah. We should go talk to him. I know where we can find him." So this brings us to our second coincidence, and that is that the author of 2 Kings wants the reader to understand that Joram actually saw his disobedience as justified. His statement in verse 10 shows that he was not only being disobedient, he was trying to put any blame and any consequences that would come as a result of his disobedience on God, which is a big deal. He doesn't want to accept responsibility for his own decisions. And it's actually reminiscent of the story we find in 1 Samuel, where King Saul actually is removed from king of Israel by God, and David is chosen instead because of the same issue. Saul saw his disobedience as justified. So I hope you can see the theme that the author of 2 Kings is trying to convey, but for now, we're going to continue reading the story. Moving on with the story in verse 13, Elisha said to the king of Israel, "Why do you want to involve me? Go to the prophets of your father and the prophets of your mother." "No," the king of Israel said, "because it was the Lord who called us 3 kings together to deliver us into the hands of Moab." And Elisha said, "As surely as the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, if I did not have respect for the presence of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, I would not pay any attention to you. But now bring me a harpist." So in this portion, we find that Elisha, the prophet, doesn't want anything to do with King Joram. He knows that he's in disobedience, and he knows that his mission is not justified or sanctified. And he flat out tells him, "Why are you even involving me in this? Go listen to the prophets that you like to listen to, the false prophets of your mother and your father, who will tell you exactly what you want to hear." But once again, Joram tries to place all the blame, guilt, and consequence on God if things go wrong. He once again claims that God is the one who brought the 3 kings together when the text has clearly shown and the author has clearly shown that God didn't have anything to do with this. And then the prophet Elisha says, "Listen, if King Jehoshaphat wasn't here, then I wouldn't even pay you any attention. But because King Jehoshaphat is here, who was known as a godly king, then I will at least inquire of the Lord to see what he has to say about this." Back to the story. While the harpist was playing, the hand of the Lord came on Elisha, and he said, "This is what the Lord says. I will fill this valley with pools of water. For this is what the Lord says. You will see neither wind nor rain, yet this valley will be filled with water, and you, your cattle, and other animals will drink. This is an easy thing in the eyes of the Lord. He will also deliver Moab into your hands. You will overthrow every fortified city and every major town. You will cut down every good tree, stop up all the springs, and ruin every good field with stones." Now we're just going to take a minute and mention that this is the prophecy that Dan mentions in his clip, in which he says the prophecy was never fulfilled. And what I want to do is pay special attention to the actual prophecy, how it was worded, and the order in which things were told they would happen, because that's going to play a huge role in the narrative of the story. And it's also going to be a prime piece of information and evidence that we use to correlate the different theories and narratives at the end of the story, to see which ones make the most plausible sense based off the evidence that we have, and which ones require us to make up evidence in order to fit the narrative. First thing that the prophecy mentions is that God would fill the valley with pools of water, even though there would be no rain, so that the men, their cattle, and their animals could drink. The second thing the prophecy mentions is that Moab would be delivered into their hands. The third thing the prophecy mentions is that they would overthrow every fortified city and every major town. The fourth thing the prophecy mentions is that they would cut down every good tree, they would stop up all the springs, and they would ruin every good field with stones. And that's it. That's all the information that Elisha would give Joram. It's also important to mention, like we did earlier, that Elisha made it clear that this was not an approved or sanctioned mission by God. The prophecy that he then proceeds to give is simply a description of the actions that the armies of the king of Israel, the king of Edom, and the king of Judah would take during their conquest of Moab. So it's not an endorsement of their actions. It's simply saying, hey, this is how it's going to play out if you continue on this path. The next morning, about the time for offering the sacrifice, there it was, water flowing from the direction of Edom, and the land was filled with water. Now all the Moabites had heard that the kings had come to fight against them. So every man, young and old, who could bear arms, was called and stationed on the border. When they got up early in the morning, the sun was shining on the water, and to the Moabites across the way, the water looked red, like blood. "That's blood," they said. "The kings must have fought and slaughtered each other. Now to the plunder, Moab." Now the next morning, just like Elisha had prophesied, water began to flow through the valley and cover the land. And the armies of Israel, Judah, and Edom were able to drink the water, gather it for their animals, and rejuvenate their forces. Now the Moabites, on the other hand, were just waking up, and they were looking out over the horizon in expectation that the kings and their armies were coming. And what they saw, likely due to it being a sunrise, was a valley covered in a liquid that had a reddish tint to it, and to them it looked like blood. And so they sat there and thought to themselves, wow, today's our lucky day. The armies must have all gotten angry with each other, gotten into a fight, and they all slaughtered each other. Let's go down to their encampment and steal all their spoils for ourselves. But when the Moabites came to the camp of Israel, the Israelites rose up and fought them until they fled. And the Israelites invaded the land and slaughtered the Moabites. They destroyed the towns, and each man threw a stone on every good field until it was covered. They stopped up all the springs and cut down every good tree. Only Ker Hareseth was left with its stones in place. But men armed with slings surrounded it and attacked it. So here we're actually going to get our third and our fourth coincidences. The third is that if you notice, the writer of 2 Kings is drawing the attention of the reader to the fact that the prophecy of Elisha is being fulfilled. He describes the events that happen in the same exact order as what the prophecy had foretold. And just in case you needed a little reminder, the first part of the prophecy was that the land would be filled with water so that the army could rejuvenate themselves. The second part was that Moab would be delivered into the hand of the Israelites. The third, that Israel would overthrow every fortified city and major town. And the fourth, that they would cut down every good tree, stop up every brook, and ruin every good field with stones. Now, the fourth coincidence is something that a lot of people don't even notice, but it's something that the writer of 2 Kings knew that his audience would recognize. And that is, not only is the prophecy being fulfilled, but Israel and King Joram is once again breaking an express command given by God back in Deuteronomy. If we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 19, we read, "When you lay siege to a city for a long time, fighting against it to capture it, do not destroy its trees by putting an axe to them, because you can eat their fruit. Do not cut them down." So back in Deuteronomy, God gives the express command, you are not allowed to cut down good trees when you go to war with another nation. And that's because back in that culture, trees were essential to providing food for the people in the area. So if an army cut down every good tree, then they were essentially cutting off any food supply for the entire area for years to come, making it uninhabitable. Once again, King Joram feels that his disobedience is being blessed by God. And this is something that the writer of 2 Kings consistently keeps trying to show us throughout the chapter. Now we get to the end of the story, and we get to see Dan's full claim in its full context. When the king of Moab saw that the battle had gone against him, he took with him 700 swordsmen to break through to the king of Edom, but they failed. Then he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and offered him as a sacrifice, or Dan's translation says a burnt offering, on the city wall. And the fury, or again Dan's translation says wrath, against Israel was great, and they withdrew and returned to their own land. So here the text describes the king of Moab, Mesha, sees that he lost the battle, and in a last-ditch effort, he takes 700 of his swordsmen and tries to break through the battle lines to the king of Edom, but they fail. So the text then says he takes his only son and offers him as a burnt offering on the city wall, and then the text describes a divine wrath that came against Israel and caused them to withdraw their troops and leave the land. So the question naturally arises, where did the divine wrath come from, and why was Israel forced to withdraw their troops and leave the land? Now, from the beginning, Dan has been telling us that we need to let the text speak for itself, that we can't just make up our own evidence in order to force the text to say what we want it to say. And that's why we've gone through this entire chapter, to lay out the context and let the text actually speak for itself. And we're not going to change our strategy now. We're going to let the text speak for itself. So the first thing we want to notice is that the text actually lets us know that the king of Moab, Mesha, knew that he lost the battle. And so in a last-ditch effort, he took 700 of his swordsmen and tried to break through the battle lines to the king of Edom, but they failed. Now, this would naturally mean that most of his swordsmen died in that battle, meaning that he didn't have an army left surrounding him to protect him. So the text then says he took his only son and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. Now, the crucial question that's going to come into play here is, why did he do this? We already know from the text that the army of Moab was defeated, that all the cities had been laid to ruin, and that the last surviving swordsmen that were there to protect Mesha were killed in battle as they tried to break through the battle line. Now, we already know from the text that Mesha was previously under oath to Israel as a vassal nation, and he decided to break that oath and revolt against them. Now, back in that culture, alliances were everything, and if a king broke an oath to an allied nation and led a rebellion against them, then that was a crime punishable by death, which is why King Joram, the king of Israel, even though he was breaking a command by God, decided to go to war with Moab because they had broken the treaty. So we have a foreign king guilty of a crime punishable by death who's just lost a battle and been captured by the enemy. Now, I don't think you have to be a biblical scholar to see where this is headed. Now, in that culture, most nations, when they would lose a battle, would offer a burnt offering to their God as a form of atonement for losing the war. We see this represented in Judges chapter 20, verse 26, 1 Samuel 7, 9 and 10, Joshua chapter 8, verse 30 and 31, and also in 2 Samuel chapter 24. Now, Mesha had just lost the battle to the Israelites, so it would be expected of him to offer a burnt offering of atonement to his god Chemosh for losing the battle. However, Israel also had a vested interest in this because Mesha was likely scheduled for execution for breaking the treaty and leading the rebellion. So the text actually seems to indicate that he then took his son as a substitute to protect his own life and offered his son as a burnt offering in his place. Now again, back then in those cultures, his son would have been the natural heir to the throne if Mesha died. And the text actually explicitly tells us this. And so if a king were to be executed or put to death or killed by a foreign nation, then the heir to the throne would actually be responsible for seeking retribution for the death of their king. In the ancient Near East, the culture revolved around honor. So if a king lost a battle, then he lost his honor to the attacking nation. And the new heir to the throne would be responsible for reclaiming that honor for the royal family. If he didn't do that, he would be seen as dishonoring his family and disgracing their name. And so we get to see that Mesha's sacrifice would have provided a win-win situation for both parties involved. Mesha would have gotten the opportunity to buy back his life by offering a substitute as a burnt offering for his sin of breaking his oath with Israel, and Israel got the guarantee that there would not be future bloodshed and they would not be attacked in the future by a nation trying to reclaim their honor. Problem with this, outside of its just normal moral implications, is that if there's one thing that God repeatedly told the Israelites that he hated and detested, almost more than anything else in the Old Testament, it was the practice of child sacrifice. We see this in Deuteronomy 12:31. You shall not worship the Lord your God in this way. For every abominable thing that the Lord hates, they have done for their gods. They have burnt their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods. Here, God is directly stating that he hates the practice of child sacrifice in the surrounding nation. He repeats this in Deuteronomy 18:10. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or their daughter in the fire, or who practices divination or sorcery, or interprets omens and engages in witchcraft. Again in Jeremiah 7:31. And they have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command, nor did it come into my mind. And again in Ezekiel 16:20. And you took your sons and your daughters, whom you bore to me, and sacrificed them as food to the idols. Was your prostitution not enough, that you slaughtered my children and sacrificed them to idols? Now, this would have been the breaking point in God's patience. Up until now, he had continued to bless Israel even while they were breaking his commands. And the author of 2 Kings has made a concerted effort to show us that King Joram was in consistent rebellion against the commands and the laws of God. It started with him attacking Moab, even though God had commanded them not to harass Moab. King Joram then goes on to try to cover his tracks and make sure that God receives the blame in case his mission goes south by claiming that God had sanctified his mission and brought the kings together. He then completely disregards Elisha's warning that his mission was not sanctified or approved by the Lord, and then during the war, he breaks God's laws and commands for war strategy. Throughout all of this, God is patient and he continues to bless Israel because they are his people. However, even after King Joram secures the victory and captures the king of Moab in a final act of defiance for the commands of the Lord, and to humiliate the enemy, but also secure his future well-being, he allows the king of Moab to offer a human sacrifice. And here is where God draws the line. And he finally says, enough is enough. He then pours his wrath out on the allied nations and exiles them from the land of Moab. So now that we've actually read the story, heard what the text has to say, and let the text speak for itself, we're going to go back to the three theories that scholars would argue best explains what happens at the end of this passage, including Dan's, and we're going to go through the pieces of evidence one by one that the text has established for us, and we're going to see if it actually helps support that theory or if it helps discredit that theory. Now, just to reiterate, in case you didn't remember, the three different theories that have been put forth by scholars, including Dan, is that the divine wrath came from the Moabites' god Chemosh, who defeated the God of Israel and drove Israel from the land. This left Elisha's prophecy unfulfilled. The second theory is that the wrath came from the Moabite army, who was stirred by seeing their king sacrifice his son and drove Israel out of the land. However, this theory would acknowledge that the prophecy from Elisha was already fulfilled at that point. And the third theory is that the wrath came from the God of Israel because the constant disregard for his laws and commands by King Joram finally reached a boiling point when he allowed the human sacrifice of Mesh's son. And so God drove the allied nations out of the land for their sin and disobedience. However, this theory would also acknowledge that the prophecy given by Elisha at this point had already been fulfilled. Now, to keep it simple, we're just going to label these three theories the Chemosh theory, the Moabite theory, and the God theory. And we're going to keep them down here on the bottom of the page. And as we go through our pieces of evidence one by one, we're going to add a point to each theory if it helps support that theory. If the evidence is neutral, meaning it does not support or discredit the theory and really isn't relevant to the theory, then we're not going to do anything. And if the evidence discredits the theory, we're going to subtract a point. Now, the thing that's going to be helpful is we're actually going to look at pieces of evidence that the text clearly gives us. We're going to look at factual information that can be proven and can be substantiated through the text and through other historical pieces of evidence that we have. No theories, no interpretations. No, it must mean this or it must mean that. We're going to rely strictly on the evidence. Now, our first piece of evidence was that the text explicitly tells us that Israel was commanded not to subdue Moab. We find Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 9 explicitly forbids Israel from harassing or taking Moab's land, since Yahweh gave it to Lot's descendants. However, in 2 Kings 3, verses 4 to 7, it tells us that Israel had explicitly broken this command with no regard for God's law. Now, if we go with the Chemosh theory, this piece of evidence has little, if any, relevance to the theory, and it's just a piece of random information. Now, if we go with the Moabite theory, this again has little to no relevance to the theory itself. However, one could argue that the Moabite people wouldn't be too happy about being in vassalage to Israel. So although it doesn't have any real relevance to the theory itself, I'm still going to give it a point because even though it's not plausible, it could technically be argued that the wrath that came from the Moabite army and drove Israel out of the land originated because of their anger of being under vassalage to Israel. Now, if we go with the God theory, a strong prevailing claim in the theory itself is that the wrath came from God because of the consistent disobedience of King Joram. And so this piece of evidence is actually extremely relevant to the theory itself because it shows us that the author is including it for a specific purpose and for a specific reason to show a theme of Israel's disobedience throughout the chapter. If we look at our second piece of evidence, consistent focus on King Joram's disobedience, King Joram was portrayed as a lawbreaker who clung to the sins of Jeroboam. The author of 2 Kings consistently highlights his casual disregard for God's law. Half of the entire chapter is solely dedicated to pointing out his disobedience. We find it in verse 2 to 3, 4 to 9, 10, 13 through 14, and 24 to 25. That's 13 verses in total in a chapter that only has 27. Now, if we're going to hold to the Chemosh theory, then this piece of evidence has no relevance to supporting the theory. The Moabite god Chemosh would not care about King Joram's disobedience to his own God, the God of Israel. Now, if we go with the Moabite theory, this once again has no relevance to the theory itself. King Joram's disobedience to his own God would have no relevance to stirring the wrath of the Moabite army against the allied nations of Israel. However, if we hold to the God theory, then this piece of evidence is again extremely relevant. If the wrath came from the God of Israel, then it would make logical sense for the author of 2 Kings to spend half of the entire story showing us what built up to that moment and where the wrath came from. If we look at our third piece of evidence, Elisha's reluctance to be involved, Elisha explicitly states that the only reason he agrees to even honor the request of King Joram is because of Jehoshaphat, who was a righteous king. His reluctance to be involved shows that he doesn't expect divine favor for Joram and that God does not sanction his mission. Now, if we hold to the Chemosh theory, Elisha's reluctance to be involved would have no bearing whatsoever on this piece of evidence being relevant to the theory. The Moabite god Chemosh would have no regard for the God of Israel or any of his prophets. The reluctance of one of God's prophets to give a prophecy would do absolutely nothing to incur the wrath of the Moabite god Chemosh. The same holds true if we go with the Moabite theory. The Moabites had their own god Chemosh, so they could care less if one of the prophets of the God of Israel didn't want to be involved. And Elisha's reluctance to be involved in the process would do nothing to stir the wrath of the Moabite army. However, if we go with the God theory, and we say that the wrath actually came from the God of Israel, then this would again be relevant to the theory. The author makes sure to point out that the prophet Elisha knew that King Joram was in disobedience of God's commands and did not expect divine favor for their mission. And he also told King Joram that God had not sanctioned his mission by telling him that if he wanted good news and he wanted to have his actions validated, to go to the false prophets that his father and his mother loved and to leave him out of it. If we look at our fourth piece of evidence, the prophecy is fulfilled before the sacrifice ever happens. Everything that Elisha predicted from the God of Israel happens before the sacrifice. In verse 25, the army receives refreshment from supernatural water, the cities are destroyed, trees are cut, wells are stopped, and fields are ruined, all in the exact order as prophesied. The sacrifice only occurs after this defeat of Moab, not before. So again, with the Chemosh theory, whether a prophecy that was prophesied by a prophet of the God of Israel came to pass or not would have no relevance to stirring the wrath of the Moabite god Chemosh, and the irrelevance would bleed over into the Moabite theory. The Moabite army could care less about a prophet of Israel. They had their own prophets, and they saw the God of Israel as inferior to their god Chemosh. So they would not care about a weaker God and the prophecy of an inferior prophet. However, if we're going to run with the God theory and assume that the wrath came from the God of Israel, then this portion of scripture would be extremely relevant to the theory itself. It would once again be highlighting and putting on stage the complete and utter disregard that King Joram had for the commands and laws of God, because Elisha told him that he would do these things in disregard for the law of God. And rather than correct his course and choose to start walking in obedience, King Joram doubled down and decided that his pride and his arrogance were more important than following the commands of God. And this would directly correlate to why the author included it in the story, to show the gradual buildup to the God of Israel pouring out his wrath on the nation of Israel and their allies. Moving on to our fifth piece of evidence, that is the Hebrew word kesef. Now, just as a side note, the reason the original Hebrew word is not in this description is because for some reason, every time I would try to type the word into the text box, it would crash the entire program. So I just had to write the word for wrath. But anyway, throughout the Hebrew Bible, the word kesef consistently refers to divine wrath originating from Yahweh.
The word here for wrath, ketsef, the noun, only ever occurs in narrative in reference to the wrath of God.
Never does it reference it originating from any other pagan deity. So for someone to attribute this term to Chemosh's anger would require inventing an entirely new and unsupported precedent with no textual basis. Now, if we start with the Chemosh theory, this piece of evidence actually discredits the theory because it actually requires us to invent or fabricate a completely new precedent while having no textual basis for doing so. If we go with the Moabite theory, we see the exact same problem. There's no precedent in the entirety of the Hebrew Bible for this wrath originating from anyone other than Yahweh. Now, if we look at the God theory, then this piece of evidence actually supports the theory because we do have actual evidence and a textual basis showing that throughout the entirety of the Hebrew Bible, the word kesef is only ever attributed to the God of Israel. Our sixth piece of evidence is a short one, but the text never mentions Chemosh. Throughout the entirety of the text in 2 Kings chapter 3, it never mentions or even alludes to Chemosh's involvement in the story. Meanwhile, the God of Israel is specifically mentioned by name 9 times and is shown to be a focal point in the story. So if we move to the Chemosh theory, this piece of evidence would actually detract from the validity of the theory. Chemosh's name is never mentioned in the text, and there's absolutely nothing in the entirety of the text that would even allude to him being an active participant in the story. In short, for us to believe that the wrath came from Chemosh, it would require us to make up a whole cloth scenario and fabricate evidence to make it relevant to the theory. Moving on, the lack of Chemosh's presence in the story doesn't necessarily add to or detract from the Moabite theory. If we assume the wrath came from the Moabites, then this is just a useless piece of information. However, looking to the God theory, this actually supports that theory. The God of Israel is mentioned specifically by name 9 times, and he is also seen as a focal point in the story. So it would support and show relevance to the theory that the wrath came from the God of Israel. All right, number 7. This may sound a little odd up front, but the text says that the wrath fell on Israel, not Moab. If Chemosh were appeased, we would logically think that the wrath would fall on Israel. But this simply isn't the case, and it doesn't fit with what we know historically about Moabite theology. The text specifically says that great wrath came against Israel, and this indicates divine punishment, not victory. According to Moabite theology, Chemosh's anger would have affected his own people, not the Israelites. If Chemosh were truly the source of the great wrath, then the object of that wrath should have been Moab. And we know this because of actual historical evidence. In 1868, Mesha steel was discovered in Jordan. It's a Moabite stone from 9th century BCE that detailed King Mesha's victories over Israel. Now, the Mesha stele uses the same kind of language. It tells us that Chemosh's anger burned against Moab because they had sinned, and so he allowed them to be defeated by Israel. However, later, when Chemosh's anger subsides, Moab regains victory. So according to Moabite theology, Chemosh's wrath means his own nation, Moab, would suffer, not Israel. Therefore, if Chemosh were actually angry, then his wrath would logically affect his own nation. However, if Chemosh were appeased, his power would imply divine success, not Israel's retreat. To surmise, if the sacrifice to Chemosh truly summoned his divine intervention, then the result should have been Moab's triumph. But we don't read anything about Moab's triumph. All we read about is Israel withdrawing. The text never mentions Moab pursuing, conquering, or even celebrating a victory over Israel. Israel just simply retreats under divine wrath, which would fit with how we understand our current textual and historical evidence. So if we go with the Chemosh theory, we essentially have to disregard every piece of current textual and historical evidence that we already have verified. And we have to invent and make up brand new entire cloth scenarios in order to give the theory any validity. So this evidence clearly detracts from the Chemosh theory. Now, if we go to the Moabite theory, and we assume that the anger and the wrath came from the Moabites, then while the textual evidence could read it as a plausible scenario, the historical evidence does not. And so because half of the evidence makes the theory plausible, but the other half of the evidence detracts from the theory, we're going to neither add or subtract a point here. But if we look at the God theory, then the great wrath coming from the God of Israel fits with the textual evidence, and it also fits with the narrative of the story, showing the consistent rebellion of Israel and King Joram against God, leading to him pouring out his wrath on Israel and their allies. And it also fits with the historical evidence that we have, which shows us that ancient Near Eastern cultures believed that their God's appeasement or anger directly affected their own nation and people. I know it's been a while, but we're coming down the home stretch. Number 8 is going to be a pretty quick one because it follows right on the heels in the same thought process of number 7, and that is the book of 2 Kings theme of Yahweh's wrath. In Kings specifically, and in the entirety of the Hebrew Bible as well, defeat always results from Yahweh's displeasure, never from another God's power. If we want to look at a few specific examples, right in the same framework of this story, we can look at 2 Kings 17, 18-20, and 2 Kings 24, 3-4. 17, 18-20 say, "So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah was left, and even Judah did not keep the commands of the Lord their God. They followed the practices that Israel had introduced. Therefore the Lord rejected all the people of Israel. He afflicted them and gave them into the hands of plunderers until he thrust them from his presence." And if we look at 24 verse 3, we see the same thing. "Surely these things happened to Judah according to the Lord's command, in order to remove them from his presence because of the sins of Manasseh and all that he had done, including the shedding of innocent blood." So again, just like with number 7, the issue is that we don't have any textual precedent showing a military incursion of Israel that failed being the result of any God's power other than Yahweh. And so if we look at the Chemosh theory, this piece of evidence once again detracts from it because it completely contradicts it, and it would require us to completely fabricate and make up an entirely new precedent just so that we can make a claim that the theory is valid. The same would be true for the Moabite theory. However, this piece of evidence would, once again, not only support, but also verify the God theory. Finally, we come to our last piece of evidence, number 9, and that is the writer of 2 Kings theological framework. The author of 2 Kings consistently writes from a Yahweh-centric perspective. He always attributes all victories, defeats, blessings, and judgments to Yahweh alone. So to suggest that he would have penned the god Chemosh randomly intervening would completely contradict the author's entire theological agenda. I think sometimes that we forget that the Bible was written by human authors, and the author of 2 Kings in multiple places claims God as the only God. In 2 Kings 5:15, we read, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel." And in 2 Kings 19:15, we read, "And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, Lord, the God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim. You alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth." So the author of 2 Kings sees Yahweh as the one true God, rivaled by no other deity, and the creator of heaven and earth. Within the mind of the author of 2 Kings, he would have never suggested that another deity could overpower Yahweh. So if we hold to the Chemosh theory, then we have to completely disregard the writer's theological framework. We have to dismiss his cultural belief, and we have to completely ignore the multiple instances in which he specifically calls Yahweh the one true God. And this would, of course, detract from the Chemosh theory. The same would be said for the Moabite theory. If the author of 2 Kings felt that his God, Yahweh, was the true God and rivaled by no other deity, then he definitely wouldn't suggest that a bunch of random mortal men could defeat his God. But holding to the God theory, it would fit within the cultural framework of the writer of 2 Kings to assign the divine wrath to his God Yahweh, whose anger was kindled by the flagrant disregard for his commands and his laws from Israel and King Joram. So now that we've actually read the story, let the text speak for itself, and looked at each piece of evidence and seen how it correlates and how it affects each of the different theories being pushed, what we're going to do now is go back and watch the original claim made by Dan. And we're going to see how it holds up now that we actually have a little bit more information.
But let's move on. 2 Kings 3:27, this is a really cool story about an Israelite, Judahite, Edomite coalition that tries to invade Moab in order to return Moab to vassalage after the king has tried to throw off that vassalage to Israel. They're about to fulfill a prophecy given to the prophet by Adonai when this happens. Then he, and this is likely Mesha, the king of Moab.
Nope, we let the text speak for itself, just like you said, and this was not likely Mesha, this was definitively Mesha.
Took his firstborn son who was to succeed him and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. And great wrath came upon Israel, so they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. So in the story, the coalition fails in their goal to return Moab to vassalage. They retreat without having fulfilled the prophecy. Why?
Well, that's kind of an odd question because there is no why. We let the text speak for itself, and the text clearly told us that the prophecy was already fulfilled, down to the exact order of events that were prophesied. Dan is the one constantly trying to override the text and tell it what it's allowed to say, because he needs it to fit his theory and his dogma.
Because the king sacrificed his son and heir on the city wall, and then it says, great wrath came upon Israel. The word here for wrath, ketsef, the noun, only ever occurs in narrative in reference to the wrath of God.
Thank you for pointing out that the word kesef only ever appears in narrative when referencing the wrath of God.
Now, this is one instance where it can't be Adonai, the God of Israel.
Well, according to the evidence, the only reason that it couldn't be is because it doesn't fit the narrative that Dan wants to push, and because he didn't get to tell the text what it's allowed to say.
That is responsible for this wrath. That doesn't make any sense.
So literally 8 seconds after telling us that the word kesef only ever appears in narrative form when talking about the wrath of God, Dan's going to throw the evidence out the window because he doesn't like what the text has to say, so he's got to tell it what it's allowed to say.
Which is why scholars acknowledge, and I have a survey I'm working on that will allow me to be able to say whether or not it's a majority. I don't know at this point.
I do. It's not.
But a lot of prominent scholars agree that this can only refer to the wrath of a deity.
Yes, I'm sure a lot of prominent scholars do agree that this wrath could have only come from a deity, because you just told us 8 seconds ago that this wrath only ever occurs in narrative when talking about the wrath of Yahweh. But now, because it's inconvenient to fit your theory, you're going to tell us why that's not possible.
And in this case, it must be the wrath of the patron deity of Moab, Chemosh, who must have driven out the invading force.
Well, I mean, if we're going to just entertain theories that must have been or could have been, that don't include any evidence to back them up, maybe it was just Chemosh's cousin Bob who was filling in for him for the day. Or maybe it was just the wrath of bad storytelling striking from nowhere. Or it could have been the ghost of the Pharaoh of Egypt still holding a grudge against Israel.
In other words, Adonai was defeated by the god of another nation.
There is quite literally no textual evidence that would even come close to supporting that claim. But I think we might be able to make up some whole cloth scenarios that would fit that viewpoint, as long as we're just ignoring all the evidence and telling the text that it has to say what we want it to.
That is the only way to interpret this text.
Well, it's the only way that you want to interpret the text, because we did exactly what you told us to. We let the text speak for itself. We looked at all the evidence, and just in case you weren't paying attention, your theory came up just a little short.
That does not require we just make up out of whole cloth scenarios that are not in evidence.
Whew, so glad that nobody tried to do that.
In order to skirt around the plain and most likely sense of the text to arrive at what we think the text is allowed to say. Now, this is one instance where it can't be Adonai, the God of Israel, that is responsible for this wrath. That doesn't make any sense. And in this case, it must be. That is the only way to interpret this text. So I think that's a fascinating story.
And here's where we get our second point of agreement. I actually think they were fascinating stories too. I just wish I knew if Dan was talking about the story that we actually read in the text, or the story that he made up out of whole cloth scenarios to arrive at what he thought the text was allowed to say.
And obviously, the creator of that video is not going to agree regarding what the Bible says.
I mean, I don't personally know the content creator that Dan's referencing, but I'm pretty sure I can say with a fair amount of confidence that she probably would agree with what the Bible says. So the second last thing I want to do before we end this video is just encourage you that if you are somebody who watches Dan's videos and you listen to the things that he has to say, I would encourage you to seek out the evidence and do your own research just to make sure that you're getting the full story. Because throughout the entirety of that video that we just talked about and that we covered in part 1, all Dan did was make a bunch of dogmatic claims. And not only did he not provide any evidence for those claims, the claims that he made completely contradicted the textual and historical evidence that we already have. Dan talked a lot about letting the text speak for itself, but every single time he didn't like what the text had to say, he decided he was going to overrule it and tell it what it was allowed to say. And that's not what we do here. Now, I want to reiterate, just like I did in part 1, that Dan is a very smart guy. I do respect him a lot for his knowledge and for the dedication that he's put towards his education. Somebody has to truly enjoy something in order to invest the amount of time that Dan has in his education. And so this video isn't to say that Dan's a bad person or that you shouldn't listen to Dan, but it is a video to say that you should always be careful about the things that you believe, and you shouldn't just swallow somebody's dogma because they tell you to. And if you ask somebody to prove their claim, and instead of providing you with evidence, they just continue on with dogmatic language, then it should raise some red flags. If it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's swimming in the lake, and it has a beak and feathers, and you want to tell me it's not really a duck, but just a miniature cow that looks like a duck, then you need to at least be able to give me some kind of evidence to support that claim, other than, well, we can't see its feet, so I'm pretty sure that it has hooves down there. That's the only logical conclusion we can have without making up scenarios. The last thing I want to say is that if you did find this video encouraging, enjoyable, or even just interesting, please take a minute to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below. It really helps the channel grow, and I always do my best to engage with anybody who wants to have a discussion. Now you see me? Whoa. So that's it. I hope you did enjoy the video. And more than anything, I hope that you learned a little bit more about the scripture. And until next time, have a good night.
We got just everything you need. We're here to take the lead. It's not like anything you've seen. Yeah, you best believe. We are the answers to your dreams. We only guarantee